Chapter 1. The Shadow Who Smoked Her Pipe. The rain fell in a polite, unhurried manner that suited the prestige of Charnwood Grange, a sprawling Edwardian estate nestled in the mist-veiled hills of Derbyshire. The grey sky pressed softly on the shoulders of the house, whose ivy-strangled facade betrayed its lineage of secrets. Inside, warmth clung to the fringes of luxury. Persian rugs, chandeliers dimmed by decades, and mahogany so polished it gleamed like wet stone. It was Lady Agnes Charnwood's birthday, though few dared call it a celebration. She had turned 73 that morning, and despite her enduring wealth and status, her face bore the expression of one who had outlived joy. The drawing-room buzzed with thinly veiled tension. Silver was polished, crystal decanters aligned. The room was alive with the murmur of high society, half-whispers, awkward laughter, and compliments born more from social contract than affection. Present were the usual players in her tightly curated circle, nieces and nephews, companions and business-minded well-wishers, all with champagne in hand and calculation behind the eye. And seated by the rain-pattered window was Miss Celestine Vale, the lady's once intimate companion, now a figure of muted rebellion. Her lean fingers curled around a porcelain pipe, oddly coloured, floral-patterned, and unmistakably out of place. It was the pipe that many guests would later remember. At precisely 8:34 p.m., just after a lacklustre toast delivered by the beleaguered family solicitor, a scream rang from the east wing. It was raw and honest, like a string snapping. Within minutes, Lady Agnes's lady's maid, young, pallid more a little, stumbled into the hallway, her cheeks wet, her mouth struggling to shape the horror she had just seen. Lady Agnes Charnwood lay dead in her study, slumped at her desk, face down over a letter she had not signed. A blot of ink pooled beneath her head. A red stain bloomed through the back of her silver gown. No one touched her, not at first. It seemed as if even death respected her command of silence. Inspector Farrow of the Derbyshire Constabulary arrived with dutiful haste. Middle-aged and stiff in posture, he surveyed the body, the room, the reticent gathering of witnesses. A letter-opener, an antique silver one engraved with a lion rampant, was missing from the usual stand on the desk. There were no signs of forced entry, no struggle, no bloody footprints on the Persian rug. Just a silent study, a dead woman and a strange scent. Smoke. Faint. Floral. Lingering near the drapes. She dismissed the maid an hour before, Farrow muttered. No alibi. No one left the house. Locked room, closed circle. He looked up at the assembled guests, neatly ordered now in the long gallery, their eyes flickering between shock, confusion, and something harder to name. She was composing her new will, murmured Felix Charnwood, her nephew. She said it was time to correct some mistakes. The silence that followed was thick, glued with implication. Farrow asked the guests to remain on the estate until further notice. The storm outside only strengthened his request. Trains wouldn't run until morning. Roads were narrow, fog-slicked, and dangerous. The perfect conditions, perhaps, for an unspoken truth to linger just out of reach. Miss Celestine Vale, calm as ever, stood apart from the others. She tapped her pipe out against the hearthstone. Her eyes, grey and opaque as mist, revealed nothing. By 10 p.m., Farrow had compiled a list of names and began preliminary inquiries. Each guest claimed to have been in the dining room or parlour or on the phone with someone miles away, but none could explain the letter Agnes had been writing, or the single muddy footprint near the French doors, too small for a man, too large for the maid. She must have let the killer in herself, Farrow reasoned aloud, scratching his jaw. Or it was someone who never left. But no one moved. The pipe lay where Celestine had left it. Cold now, but fragrant. An odd blend. Lavender and something acrid. and it was then, just after midnight, that Poirot made the call to London. A modest apartment somewhere off Whitehall. A rotund gentleman with patent leather shoes, a silk dressing robe, and perfectly arranged moustaches received the call with raised brows. "Ah," he said, placing a final cherry in his evening glass of cordial. "A lady, a shadow, a will, and a pipe, yes?" He smiled with gentle gravity. "Tell them, s'il vous plaît, Hercule Poirot is on his way." Chapter 2. The Pipe and the Portrait. By the time Hercule Poirot arrived the next morning, the fog was still wrapped thick around Charnwood Grange like a shawl the house refused to shed. His arrival was, as always, immaculate. Black gloves, a dove-grey suit, shoes that gleamed without a single mark of Derbyshire mud, and an umbrella held with exacting precision. A lesser man might have been put off by the lingering chill, the heavy sky, or the palpable unease hanging in the hall. Poirot was not such a man. Inspector Poirot met him at the grand entrance, ushering him into the study with a stiff nod. "Apologies for the mess. The constables have cleared the body, but we've left everything else untouched." Poirot stepped over the threshold. His gaze swept the room not once, but twice. First with the wide curiosity of a man taking in an impressionist painting, then again with the narrow scrutiny of a clockmaker. The desk was still as Lady Agnes had left it. A blotting pad with a half-finished letter. Ink spilled. A second chair, slightly pushed back as if someone had stood from it in haste. The lion-handled letter opener was indeed missing. Poirot moved with care, as though afraid to disturb the air. "Voilà," he said softly, pointing to the window, one pane slightly ajar. "It doesn't open fully," Poirot said, "warped in the frame years ago. Still, nothing suggests forced entry. No signs outside, just the garden and mud. The only footprint was found inside, near the French doors. Show me, if you please." It was faint now, partially obscured by an officer's careless boot tread. But the shape remained. A heel, pointed toe, slight indentation at the arch. "Not a man's shoe," Poirot murmured. "Yet not a servant's either. Something concealed." "Yes." He bent low and drew from his pocket a small handkerchief, immaculate, monogrammed. He dabbed once at the floorboard. Damp. "Someone passed here not long before the alarm. No cleaning has occurred since?" "Nothing touched," Poirot said, "per your request." Poirot nodded with appreciation. Then his eyes turned to the hearth. The pipe. It sat in its familiar place, balanced on the edge of the iron grate. A curious object, white porcelain with tiny violet petals painted along its bowl. A woman's pipe. And yet it bore the ritualistic pride of something long in use. Poirot lifted it carefully with a gloved hand. Still the faintest scent. Lavender and opium. He sniffed again, frowning. A blend, yes, but not common, not commercial. Something personal. "Miss Celestine Vales," Poirot confirmed. "She admits it's hers, smokes it every evening. In fact, oui," Poirot said thoughtfully. "She is the only woman I have known who looks more comfortable with a pipe than a teacup." He replaced it carefully, then turned to the portrait above the mantel, a large oil painting of Lady Agnes in her youth. Painted at 30, perhaps. Sharp features, high collar, a look of command even then. "Do you notice, Inspector," Poirot said, stepping back, "that she is alone in this house even when surrounded?" Poirot furrowed his brow. "Meaning?" "Her portrait," Poirot said, gesturing. "No husband, no children beside her, no heirloom of sentiment. This was a woman who ruled, not shared." Poirot crossed his arms. She'd been estranged from her family for years. Only in the last few months did she begin allowing them back, perhaps because she was drafting a new will. Poirot's eyebrows lifted slightly. "Ah, a will. Then motive is already whispering to us." They moved into the drawing room next. where the guests had gathered, reluctantly, stiffly, with more glances at one another than at the teacups in their hands. Poirot entered, and his presence was immediate. Not grand, but undeniable. A shift in gravity. Celestine Vale looked up from her seat by the piano. Her pipe was missing from her lips, but her gaze was firm. "You'll be looking at everyone, I suppose," she said dryly. Poirot bowed with the hint of a smile. "Madame, I look at everyone, but see what others do not. That is the nature of my profession." She offered him a seat, but her expression never changed. Poirot declined with a polite gesture, choosing instead to stand. "I should like, in time, to speak with each of you. Not as accusers, non, but as participants in a moment that begs understanding. Lady Agnes did not die of age. She was murdered. And so, we must understand not only what happened, but why." Felix Charnwood, tall, flaxen-haired, with the air of a man used to being both underestimated and overlooked, cleared his throat. "Forgive me, Monsieur Poirot, but surely the answer lies in the will. My aunt had made no secret that she was planning changes." "Ah, monsieur," Poirot said, eyes narrowing slightly. "Yes, but what of the letter she was writing when she died? It was not her will." No, a personal letter. One she had not yet signed. Addressed to whom?" Felix looked down. "I don't know." "Then we must find out." "Because somewhere between a pipe's smoke and an unsigned letter," Poirot said, turning slowly back to the room, "is a shadow, and that shadow, mes amis, still walks among us." The room remained silent as Poirot's gaze passed over each face, and in the corner Miss Celestine Vale lit another match. This time, she did not smoke. She merely watched it burn. Chapter 3. Guests Who Do Not Grieve. The fog lifted slightly by afternoon, unveiling thin slants of pale light through the high windows of Charnwood Grange. Poirot stood in the central hallway, surveying a set of family photographs lined along a curved wall, portraits that strained to project harmony. There was a tension in the poses. A woman who turned her face from the child at her side. A young man whose smile seemed borrowed. Poirot tilted his head. "Families, Inspector," he said softly to Ferrot, who lingered just behind him. "They are the soil in which the roots of many crimes grow." By agreement with Ferrot, the interviews would begin that afternoon. Poirot asked not for formal interrogations, but for conversations, brief, cordial, disarming in their lack of pressure. He began with Felix Charnwood, whose sharp suits and understated cufflinks betrayed ambition thinly veiled by grief. They sat in the conservatory, where the scent of dying roses mingled with the last remains of a distant lunch. Felix crossed his legs, adjusting his collar as if performing for an invisible camera. "She was a difficult woman," he said, voice carefully measured. "Not cruel, no, but exacting. Her love was conditional. I hadn't been to the house in 5 years until recently." Poirot nodded. "And yet she invited you back. Pourquoi?" Felix shrugged. "She said she was tired, that she wanted the family around her again. I believed it was about legacy." "And the new will?" "She hinted at it. I assumed. Well, I hoped I would be included. Not because I asked for it, but because I stayed loyal when others took advantage." Poirot leaned forward slightly. "Who took advantage?" Felix's lips parted, then closed again. He looked to the window. "You'd best ask my cousin Lydia. She's good at putting herself forward when it counts." Poirot made a small mental note. Miss Lydia Charnwood came next, a woman in her late 30s dressed in fine beige linen with a silk scarf knotted tightly at the throat. She did not sit. She paced, slowly, deliberately, like one accustomed to owning the floor. "I loved my aunt," she said, "but she was stubborn. She believed sentimentality was weakness. She didn't even allow flowers at her husband's funeral, said Decay does not deserve perfume. Can you imagine? Poirot did not flinch, and yet you returned to her household. I was summoned, Lydia replied with a brittle smile. She said there were things she wanted to put in order. She had grown afraid of the wrong people being remembered. And who, in her view, were the wrong people? Lydia stopped walking. Her fingers touched the knot of her scarf. Her companion, Miss Vale. She had a strange hold over Agnes. It started as friendship, but eventually she was writing her correspondence, managing her appointments, intercepting visitors. Poirot raised a brow. So she was protective. Possessive, Lydia corrected, and persuasive. Too much, for someone with no blood claim to the Charnwood estate. When Lydia left the room, Poirot let the silence settle. Farrow, observing from the hall, entered. They're circling the same target, the inspector said, each blaming the next, but this Vale woman, they all mention her. Poirot nodded slowly. Yes, but always as a threat, never as a rival. That, mon cher, is instructive. Later that evening, Poirot requested tea with Celestine Vale in the library. She was already there. I've been expecting you, she said, seated in the old armchair, her pipe once again at hand, unlit. Poirot did not sit immediately. He examined her, a woman composed as a chess player 2 moves ahead. The room smelled faintly of tobacco and dried lavender. You were close with Lady Agnes? I lived here for 13 years. Closer than blood. Closer than they ever managed, even when they tried. Madame, Poirot said gently, what did she fear in her final weeks? Celestine's mouth twitched. That she would be remembered for the wrong things, that her name would be passed like a check from hand to hand. She wanted control over her legacy. And you advised her? I listened, and yes, sometimes I offered opinions. Poirot's gaze drifted to the side table, an ashtray with a single curled leaf of burnt paper. She trusted you with the draft of her new will. She trusted me with many things, but no, I never saw the final version. Poirot picked up the pipe, examined it again. You smoke in lavender, but last night someone said it was laced with something more curious, a trace of opium. Her expression froze. She had taken to it in small doses, Celestine said quietly. For her nerves, her heart had been weakening. Poirot replaced the pipe. Was it administered in the tea? No, she infused the tobacco herself. It helped her sleep. Last night, did she smoke alone? Celestine finally looked away. She always locked the study after 9. I went to bed. I heard nothing. Poirot rose. Thank you, madame. You are calm in grief. Celestine met his eyes. Grief doesn't always weep, Monsieur Poirot. Sometimes it smokes quietly in the dark. And Poirot left the room, thoughtful, as a shadow moved behind the lace curtain on the far side of the room. Someone had been listening. Chapter 4. The Locked Study. That night, the atmosphere in Charnwood Grange deepened into something heavier than silence, something nearer to waiting. The guests had receded to their respective quarters or private corners, but no one truly slept. Poirot remained in the library until the fire had burned itself low, watching the flames collapse into memory. At 10:30, he requested access to the study once more. Inspector Farrow accompanied him, key in hand. "We've sealed the door since the body was removed," he said. "Still no sign of the missing letter opener." The door creaked open with reluctance, as though it too had suffered something and wished to remain closed. Poirot stepped inside. The study was not a large room, but it possessed a certain weight. Oil paintings of long-dead Charnwoods, heavy curtains that had once been crimson, and bookcases lined not with well-loved volumes, but untouched bindings, a collection curated to suggest authority. Poirot moved directly to the writing desk. The ink blotter was dry now, but the pages remained. The topmost sheet bore a single line, unfinished, to amend what I have allowed too long. Nothing more. No name. No date. No signature. Poirot tilted his head and murmured, "A beginning that fears the end." He lifted the sheet with delicate fingers and examined the pages beneath. Clean, untouched. The nib of the fountain pen had snapped slightly, as though pressed too hard in a moment of agitation. Behind him, Poirot ran a gloved hand along the frame of the French doors. "Still locked from the inside," he confirmed. "Latch is intact. Glass undisturbed." Poirot moved to the fireplace once again. The scent of the pipe lingered, ghostly and sweet. Then something caught his eye in the hearth. A thin, blackened curl of paper nestled beneath the grate. He stooped, retrieving it with tweezers from his pocket. "Mon ami," he said quietly. "See the ink here. A seal. A crest, maybe." Poirot leaned in. "Could it be the will?" "Or a copy," Poirot replied. "But if it was burned, it was not done thoroughly. And if someone burned it here, they either panicked or wanted it known." Poirot straightened. "But why destroy a will unless it threatened someone's claim?" Poirot's eyes twinkled. "Ah, that is the question beneath all others. Who benefits from silence?" A knock at the study door interrupted them. A maid stood there. Mora Liddell, the same girl who had discovered the body. Her face was still pale, her eyes ringed with exhaustion. "Begging your pardon, sir," she said softly. "But I remembered something strange, something about the door last night." Poirot turned gently toward her. "Oui, mademoiselle. Please come in." She stepped lightly, like someone entering a chapel. "When I brought Lady Agnes her tea just after 8, she told me not to return, but when I went back to clear the tray before bed, the door was locked, just as she said, except—" "Yes," Mora swallowed. "I thought I heard her voice, talking to someone." Poirot remained still. "A man or a woman?" I couldn't tell. Only the rhythm. She always spoke in a slow, clipped way, but this was faster, softer." Poirot's gaze sharpened. "Was the tray removed?" Mora hesitated. "No, sir. It was still inside this morning." Poirot scribbled something down. Poirot simply nodded. "Merci, Mora. That is most helpful." After she departed, Poirot wandered to the small tray table near the desk. A single cup sat there, the tea long since cold, with faint residue along its edge. He lifted the cup to the light. "See here, 2 lipstick marks, different depths, one recent, one faint." Poirot's brows rose. So, she shared her tea, or someone tasted it after. They stood a moment longer in the dim room, the fire out, the air cooled by absence. Poirot moved to the far wall, where a display cabinet stood beside a carved grandfather clock. Inside were trinkets, a miniature harp, a figurine of a falcon, and nestled discreetly, a velvet box lined with silk. Poirot opened it slowly. Empty. "Once it held something valuable," he said. "Jewels, perhaps." "Lady Agnes's emerald pendant," Poirot confirmed. "It hasn't been seen since her death. Might have been stolen." Poirot shut the box with care. Murder is often accompanied by greed, but this is more than theft. It is theater. Someone wanted this to look like a simple crime, but they chose the study. They chose a letter never sent. They chose smoke and velvet. Poirot frowned. "So what now?" Poirot's moustache twitched with satisfaction. "Now, mon ami, I speak to the one who knocked last upon this door and did not expect it to be answered." And with that, he returned to the hall, his eyes alight, his mind stirring behind quiet poise, while above them a guest listened from the second-floor stair, unseen. Chapter 5. Conversations with Shadows. Morning broke late over Charnwood Grange, as if the sun itself were reluctant to intrude. The estate remained hushed, save for the occasional shuffle of constables or the faint clink of china from the kitchens. Poirot requested his breakfast in the east-facing salon, a modest meal, perfectly arranged, and took his coffee with quiet contemplation, eyes drifting over the frost-laced garden beyond the window panes. By mid-morning, he had begun his interviews in earnest. He started with Maura Liddell. She was seated rigidly in the drawing-room, hands folded in her lap, her uniform immaculate. Poirot approached her not as a detective, but as a gentleman taking a delicate interest in the world she occupied. "You were fond of Lady Agnes?" he asked softly. Maura nodded. "Yes, sir. She was strict, but she kept her word. That's more than most." Poirot tilted his head. "And Miss Vale, how did you find her?" "She frightened me," Maura admitted. "Not in a loud way. She always knew when you were nearby. Said things you hadn't told anyone, like she saw through your coat." Poirot smiled faintly. "A woman of perceptiveness, perhaps." Maura didn't smile back. "Or a woman who listened at doors." Poirot let that rest a moment. "Tell me, this emerald pendant Lady Agnes wore, you would have seen it often?" "Yes, sir. She wore it for dinners. Green as glass, heavier than it looked." "And the last time you saw it?" Maura hesitated. "Night before she died. She was holding it in the study. Said something odd." "Odd?" Maura lowered her voice. "She can't have it. I'd rather see it vanish than pass to her hands." I asked who she meant, but she waved me out. Poirot leaned forward. "And did she hide it?" Maura shook her head. "I don't know. But it wasn't in her jewel box the next morning." When Maura left, Poirot took a moment to reflect. Then he sent for Geoffrey Latchmere, the family solicitor, and one of the few people present who had been closer to Agnes in legal terms than personal. Latchmere arrived with papers under his arm, spectacles perched low on his nose, and an air of mild inconvenience. He spoke with the slow diction of a man who preferred contracts to conversation. "Lady Agnes did not trust easily," he began. "In fact, she amended her will no fewer than 4 times in the last decade." "Was the most recent version located?" Poirot asked. "No, that is troubling." "Indeed. And to whom did the previous versions leave the estate?" "Initially, a trust. Then the Charnwood nieces and nephews equally. But I believe, though I cannot be certain, the new draft concentrated the bulk of the inheritance upon Miss Vale." Poirot's brows lifted. "Ah, and such a revision would create waves." "It would," Latchmere replied, "particularly among those who have counted on the estate's income to continue their lifestyles. Felix, heavily indebted, I believe. Lydia, ambitious, entitled, and neither holds affection for Miss Vale." Poirot allowed himself a small sigh. "And the will, if destroyed, would revert matters to a prior version." "Exactly." Poirot stood. "Merci, monsieur. You have given me the frame. Now I must paint the faces." He dismissed Latchmere and requested a walk with Lydia in the garden. She agreed, if coolly, draping a fur over her shoulders before stepping into the brittle sunshine. The wind was sharp, the sky faintly blue, but she carried herself as if neither could touch her. "I hear you've been speaking to everyone," she said, brushing a leaf from her coat. "Oui. The living have so many truths. The dead, only one." She turned to him. "You think I wanted her gone?" Poirot stopped walking. "Mademoiselle, I think you wanted a different future. But to want is not to kill." Lydia said nothing for a long moment. Then, "She was going to disinherit me. I know it. Celestine had turned her." "And the pendant?" "She never let it out of sight. I asked to borrow it once, for a charity gala, and she refused me as if I'd asked for her lungs. It's a family heirloom. And now, gone." Poirot gently touched his moustache. "Perhaps not gone, perhaps hidden. Lydia's gaze narrowed. Hidden by whom? Poirot merely smiled. The better question, mademoiselle, is who needed it to disappear more than they needed to inherit it? As they returned to the house, Poirot noticed Felix Charnwood watching from the upper window, not angry, not curious, just watching, as though he were counting each moment Poirot spent with someone else. The detective felt the weight of the emerald pendant even in its absence, and far below, in the garden's overgrown edge, something green glinted beneath the frost, unseen for now. But not for long. Chapter 6. The Emerald Ghost. That afternoon, the frost softened just enough to draw out a breath of damp earth. Poirot, having completed his garden walk with Lydia, requested solitude and returned alone to the outer edge of the grounds. A grove of old yews bordered the lawn where the grass dipped slightly, a forgotten corner where ivy clung to broken statues and the stones of a former sundial lay shattered beneath a naked oak. It was here, as the wind swept low through the hedgerow, that Poirot saw it again. A glint, not a jewel's brilliance, but something dulled by earth and time. He knelt carefully, fingertips brushing through the leaves. Beneath a blanket of browned ivy, caught in the roots of a weather-worn planter, was a chain, fine gold, thin but sturdy. Poirot traced its length to a heavy pendant, caked in soil but unmistakable, an oval-cut emerald set in antique silver filigree. Even in shadow it shimmered faintly. Ah, Poirot breathed. La voilà. He did not remove it. Instead, he surveyed the surrounding ground. No footprints led here, no obvious trail. Someone had come deliberately, avoiding soft patches, tucking it into a place where time itself might forget. Poirot stepped back, withdrawing a handkerchief from his pocket and folding it over the pendant with fastidious care. As he returned to the house, a small smile lifted the corners of his mouth. It was not a smile of triumph. It was the beginning of understanding. By the time he arrived in the study, Inspector Farrow was already waiting. "You found it?" Farrow asked, as Poirot presented the handkerchief. "Oui, not far from the sundial." Farrow opened the cloth and exhaled. "Well, this confirms theft." Poirot gently closed the handkerchief again. "Not theft, mon ami. Symbol. You see, if one were to murder for inheritance, one might try to claim the emerald pendant, not bury it. No, this was hidden. It speaks of fear." Farrow frowned. "So someone wanted it to vanish, not profit from it?" "Just so. To deny it to another. It is not a murder for possession. It is a murder of removal." Farrow scratched his head. "That's backwards." Poirot gave a small shrug. "Not for the human heart." They sat in silence for a moment. Then Farrow said, "We've finished searching Miss Vale's quarters. No sign of the will, but we did find this." He passed over a small velvet diary. Its lock snapped. Poirot opened it with great care. Inside, the pages were sparsely filled. Most entries were unemotional, brief notations of weather, meals, errands. But 3 days before the murder, one note stood apart. She asked again if I would remain if the others turned. I told her I had already chosen. She said that sealed the matter. Poirot read it twice, then once more. "She chose loyalty," he said, and so Lady Agnes made her final decision. Farrow leaned in. "Which was?" Poirot closed the diary. "To change everything." At Poirot's request, the guests were asked to remain in the drawing room once more. The same space, the same seating, but now the atmosphere was brittle, no longer muffled by shock, but sharpened by suspicion. Felix stood near the fireplace, arms folded. Lydia sat apart from him, her gloved fingers tapping restlessly against her teacup. Celestine Vale, as always, remained composed. She sat nearest the window, where light carved a narrow path across her lap. Poirot entered without fanfare. He set the folded handkerchief on the sideboard and let it rest there, unopened. I have walked your gardens, he began. I have studied your books, your letters, your faces, and I begin at last to see clearly. He turned slightly. Mademoiselle Lydia, would you say you are a patient woman? She blinked. Yes, I suppose. Then why does the tea in your hand tremble? She flushed, steadying it quickly. Because you're circling us like wolves. No one likes being hunted. Ah, but madame, Poirot said, I am not a wolf. I am a gardener. I find what has been buried. He turned to Felix. And you, monsieur, how long have you known your debts would never be forgiven? Felix straightened. My finances are not your concern. But they are the concern of a will, are they not? Felix's jaw tightened. I had no reason to harm her. No? Poirot's gaze sharpened. You expected to benefit, yes? But what if you learned she had rewritten everything and that you, who believed himself the future of the estate, were no longer named? Felix said nothing. Celestine's voice entered the room like cold wind. You're accusing everyone. No, madame, Poirot said gently. I'm observing everyone. And in observation, I see contradiction. You, who say you went to bed early, left ash on the stair rail outside Lady Agnes's study. A pipe's ash. Lavender and opium. Why there unless you listened? Celestine's hands tightened, but she did not reply. Poirot let the silence hold. You see, mes amis, the story is incomplete. The will is missing. The pendant was hidden. A letter was never signed. And someone spoke to Lady Agnes that night. Someone she knew. Someone she trusted. And after they left the room, she was dead. He reached for the handkerchief. Slowly he unfolded it. The pendant sparkled in the dim light. Tell me now, who among you feared what this symbol might bring? No one moved. But someone, somewhere in that room, had begun to sweat beneath their collar. Poirot saw it. He said nothing. Not yet. Chapter 7. The Weight of Inheritance. The room remained still for a moment longer, so quiet one could almost hear the whisper of the frost melting against the windows. Poirot replaced the pendant within the handkerchief and folded it as if sealing something more fragile than gemstones. He gave no dramatic speech, no accusation, not yet. The room, after all, was not ready. Instead, he merely bowed and said, Merci, mes amis, then exited with the calm grace of a man who had seen everything he needed to see. Inspector Farrow met him in the corridor outside, brows low and tight. You're stirring them, he said, but they're not breaking. Poirot's eyes glinted. No, not yet. The human heart is stubborn when wounded, but a crack has formed. Someone is afraid. Farrow walked beside him down the long gallery. What about the emerald? It connects to motive, certainly. But it doesn't prove murder. Poirot paused before one of the ancestral portraits. Lady Agnes's father, painted in dark greens and golds, stared from beneath a heavy brow. Do you know what Lady Agnes valued more than wealth, more than even control? Poirot asked. Farrow shrugged. Legacy, Poirot answered. Not lineage. She had little use for blood. But the idea of herself, perfectly remembered. The pendant was a symbol of that. To her, giving it or withholding it was not generosity or spite, but editing, like trimming a hedge until only symmetry remains. Farrow sighed. So you're saying she'd rather destroy her possessions than let them fall into hands she considered unworthy? Poirot gave a small nod. Precisely, which is why the will matters so deeply, and why someone may have needed to ensure it vanished. They turned a corner and nearly collided with Felix Charnwood, who appeared from the side hall with a start. His tie was loose, his eyes sharp behind a mask of practiced courtesy. Monsieur Poirot, he said, might I request a word in private? Farrow looked to Poirot, who gave a slight nod. The inspector stepped back. Felix led Poirot into the small music room, a space no longer used, where a piano rested beneath a dust cloth and a cracked cello leaned like a tired guest. "I didn't want to speak in front of the others," Felix began, his voice low. "But I have a right to know. Do you think I did it?" Poirot's brow lifted slightly. "Monsieur, I think you are a man who has grown used to a future someone else promised." Felix turned away, jaw tight. "She told me things would change. She said it was time to put things in the hands of those who would understand continuity. I assumed she meant me." "Ah, and then she summoned Miss Vale." Felix looked over his shoulder. "That woman arrived like a shadow, slipped into everything. Appointments, finances, dinner menus. One day I realized I didn't know what my aunt thought unless Celestine spoke it." Poirot tilted his head. "And yet you stayed." "She summoned me. And yes, I thought she would make things right. Then I overheard something. 2 nights before she died. She and Celestine arguing." "About?" Felix hesitated. "She said, 'You may keep the books, but not the name. The Charnwood name dies with me.'" Poirot was silent. Felix continued, voice rougher now. "That pendant, it wasn't about money. It was about pride. And if she rewrote her will, it wouldn't just hurt us financially, it would erase us. She wanted to hand her whole legacy to someone who would never carry the name forward." Poirot stepped closer. "So, you feared being forgotten?" Felix looked at him. "Isn't that a kind of murder, too?" Poirot said nothing, but he watched Felix's hands, which trembled just slightly at his sides. "Merci," Poirot said quietly. "You have given me more than you know." He left Felix in the room, alone with the forgotten music. Outside, the corridors of Charnwood Grange grew colder. Shadows deepened along the stairwells. Someone lit the hallway lamps earlier than usual. Upstairs, Poirot knocked at Lydia's door. She opened it, surprised. Her scarf had been loosened, and she looked, unusually, without armor. "I have a simple question, mademoiselle," Poirot said. "Did you see the pendant the day your aunt died?" She blinked. "No." Poirot raised a finger. "Think carefully. Did you see her wear it?" "Hold it." Lydia paused. "She wasn't wearing it at dinner. I noticed, actually. That emerald always made her look sharper." "And where were you after dinner?" "In the drawing room. Felix and I argued about the Charnwood Trust. I went to bed early. Celestine saw me leave." Poirot nodded slowly. "Then tell me this. Why did your aunt summon a solicitor that very morning?" Lydia's eyes flicked downward. "She told me. She wanted to make amends." Poirot said nothing, but the phrase echoed like a bell in his mind. When he returned downstairs, Pharaoh joined him in the study once more. Dusk now seeped in from the corners. The study felt closer, the air dense with the unsaid. Pharaoh gestured to the burnt scrap Poirot had retrieved from the fireplace days before. "We've analyzed the ink. It's from the same fountain pen she used at her desk. Legal parchment, faint impression of a signature." Poirot exhaled through his nose. So it was the will. Burned, but only in part. Poirot looked to the darkened hearth, and his voice came soft and certain. It was not destroyed. It was interrupted. And someone, he knew now, had been counting on that interruption. Chapter 8. The Whisper Behind the Books. The following morning arrived dressed in damp fog again, as though the house refused to permit clarity. The east wing remained cordoned, the study untouched since Poirot's last visit. But the silence within Charnwood Grange was no longer passive. It was watching, brittle, alert. Poirot rose early and dressed with meticulous care. His tie was silk, his moustache sharp. He descended the main staircase with the quiet rhythm of a man not merely beginning a day, but arranging it. He bypassed the breakfast room entirely and headed straight for the library. The housekeeper, Mrs. Durbridge, nearly collided with him in the corridor. Monsieur Poirot, I thought no one ever used the library at this hour. Madame, he said with a bow, sometimes one must read when the mind is most awake. She smiled faintly. It's rarely used now. Lady Agnes kept it mostly for show. And for whispers, perhaps, Poirot added lightly. Mrs. Durbridge hesitated. Beg pardon. Poirot's expression did not change. Tell me, who else entered the library regularly besides Lady Agnes and Miss Vale? The housekeeper thought for a moment. Well, Miss Lydia would often sit in the corner with her notebooks. Mr. Felix came in now and then to use the liquor cabinet. But if you mean daily, only Miss Vale. Poirot nodded. Merci. And the books? Have any gone missing recently? Mrs. Durbridge looked slightly flustered. None that I know of, but she often rearranged them. Miss Vale, I mean. Said Lady Agnes preferred a certain logic to the shelves. Poirot's eyes lit with quiet interest. A logic only she would understand. He stepped past the housekeeper and into the library. The air was cool, dry. Rows upon rows of leather spines watched him like a silent audience. The room bore no immediate signs of use, no dog-eared pages, no scattered volumes, everything in place, everything just so. Poirot moved slowly down the shelves. He was not looking for books. He was listening, for patterns, for repetition, for inconsistency. Then he saw it. A shelf lined with identical bindings, a 30-volume encyclopedia set, all beige leather, all marked with Roman numerals. Except volume 50 was ever so slightly out of alignment. Poirot drew closer, tilted his head. The edges of that volume were cleaner than the others, barely dusted. He reached out, grasped the spine, and pulled. It did not come easily. It caught for a moment, then released with a soft snap. Behind the hollowed-out book cover lay a stack of folded pages. Bound with a silk ribbon, thick parchment, and faint, elegant handwriting on the topmost sheet, Poirot held it to the light, the last will and testament of Lady Agnes Charnwood, signed, witnessed, undated, but unmistakably recent. Poirot breathed in through his nose, calm and precise. Then, carefully, he returned the ribbon and tucked the bundle into his coat. Behind him, someone moved. He did not startle. Madame Vale, he said without turning. She stood by the door, arms crossed, her grey dress catching the dull morning light. You always did know where to look, she said softly. Poirot turned now. Why hide it? Celestine did not step forward. She asked me to. She told me, if something happens, don't let them twist it. Keep it safe until the right eyes find it. She was afraid. She said it plainly. Of whom? She never said a name, Celestine replied. Only that legacy was louder than reason in this family. Poirot studied her carefully. Did you know she planned to leave you the majority? I suspected, she said, but she never said it directly. I didn't ask. Why not? Because I didn't want to owe her, Celestine said. I wanted her to choose what was right without being prompted. Poirot considered this. You did not kill her. Her eyes flared, but her voice stayed level. No, but I feared that someone else might. Poirot stepped past her gently. You may not have burned the will, madame, but you let it go cold in the dark. She did not answer. Moments later, Poirot stood once again in the study with Pharaoh, laying the rediscovered will upon the desk like a revealed secret. Pharaoh whistled. Well, that's the knife in the back for half the family. Poirot's smile was distant. More than half. This changes everything. Motive becomes legacy. Legacy becomes inheritance. And inheritance, monsieur, becomes murder. They read the contents quickly. The bulk of the estate was indeed bequeathed to Celestine Vale, with a small annual stipend to Lydia and Felix, a token gesture meant more to soothe appearances than to satisfy expectation. There was also a peculiar line in the final paragraph. To my nephew Felix, I leave nothing save the ledger he has so carefully kept hidden in his drawer. He will know what it means." Pharaoh scratched his head. "A ledger?" Poirot nodded. "Which, if we are very fortunate, still exists." He instructed Pharaoh to request the cooperation of Felix Charnwood for a final search of his study. But Poirot had already begun to map the landscape of the mind behind this crime. Fear of erasure, fear of exposure, and the small human tragedy of a name losing its place in history. And somewhere among the pages of a missing ledger was a final thread. A number, a debt, a line of ink that would soon unravel everything. Chapter 9. The ledger in the drawer. Felix Charnwood was not in his study when Poirot and Pharaoh arrived, nor was he anywhere in the East Wing. A maid reported having seen him walking quickly toward the stables shortly before breakfast, but the groomsman claimed he hadn't taken a horse. A silent unease began to settle into the bones of the house. Still, Poirot made no haste. He entered the study slowly, brushing a gloved hand across the desk as if reintroducing himself to the room. Pharaoh, less patient, strode directly to the small filing drawers beneath the tall bookshelf where Felix conducted what little business his dwindling funds allowed. It took only moments to find it, a black, leather-bound volume, the cover worn smooth at the corners, no title, no ornamentation. Pharaoh placed it gently on the desk and opened it. Ledgers, indeed, but these were not formal accounts. They were not intended for tax or inheritance. The pages contained something else. Handwritten lists of transfers, discrete payments, withdrawals under coded entries, and notes in the margins. Deferred, await estate resolution. Still pending, Agnes must not know. Poirot leaned closer. "Ah," he said softly. "It is always the margin where the truth waits." One page bore a final entry in a bolder hand, dated just 3 days before the murder. Requested full withdrawal from Charnwood Trust. Application denied. Requires trustee sign-off. AG uncooperative. Pharaoh looked up. AG Agnes. Poirot nodded. It appears Felix attempted to extract himself from a financial noose, but the noose had a name. Pharaoh flipped back through earlier pages. "There are payments to Lydia, too," he said. "Smaller, less frequent, described as consulting fees and social commissions. But some are oddly timed." Poirot tapped the open page with a gloved finger. "Look here, this entry aligns with the date Lady Agnes first met with her solicitor about the new will. 2 days later, Felix tried to move funds. She refused, and the day after that, she was dead." Pharaoh exhaled. So he feared discovery, and motive was no longer money, it was exposure. Poirot closed the book. No, it was pride. Felix feared being unmasked, not impoverished, and in families such as this, reputation is the greater currency. He gestured for Pharaoh to keep the book, then turned back toward the hallway. "We must find him, calmly, quietly, before he does something foolish." But Poirot did not move with urgency. He knew something more, that guilt, when combined with desperation, tends to return not to hiding, but to performance. And Felix was not the kind of man to disappear without ensuring his exit was seen. He was found, just before noon, not far from the drawing-room, standing before the portrait of Lady Agnes, staring at it as though it might speak. Poirot approached alone, dismissing the constable with a nod. Felix didn't turn as Poirot arrived. "She hated me in the end," he said. "No, monsieur, she was disappointed. There is a difference." Felix gave a bitter laugh. "That's not comfort." Poirot said nothing. Felix finally turned, his hands at his sides. "You've seen the book?" "I have." "I didn't kill her, Poirot. I wanted to. I was furious when she blocked the funds, but I didn't do it." Poirot studied his face. "And yet you burned the will?" Felix flinched. "Yes," Poirot said gently. "It was you. You argued with her that night. You waited until she was alone. You knocked. She let you in. You threatened her with disgrace if she rewrote the estate. Felix spoke in a whisper. She laughed at me. And when she refused, you panicked. You didn't strike her. You didn't have time. But the will on her desk, half finished, unsigned. You snatched it, fed it to the fire, then fled, not knowing she had hidden a second copy. Felix closed his eyes. I thought if the will was gone, I could still fix things. But someone else entered after you. Felix looked up now. You believe me? Poirot nodded slowly. I believe you burned the will, but I do not believe you killed her. Felix sat heavily on the window bench as if drained. So who did? Poirot folded his hands. That, monsieur, I am beginning to understand. Because you see, someone else watched you enter that room. Someone who realized Lady Agnes was writing two things, a will and a letter. Felix frowned. Letter? Poirot met his eyes. A letter of accusation, but it was never signed. Felix shook his head. I didn't see it. Poirot nodded. Exactly. He turned and left Felix in the hush of the gallery, striding now not to another interview but toward the hidden place he had long suspected, the heart of the contradiction. The key was not the will, nor the pendant, nor the ledger. The key was the unsigned letter, the one no one mentioned, because someone had known what it contained, and only the guilty ever fear a letter never sent. Chapter 10. The letter that waited. The west-facing parlor was quiet at that hour, lit only by a single oil lamp and the pale remnants of morning light slipping through gauze curtains. It was a room seldom used, far from the grand salon or the formal dining hall. Poirot had requested it specifically. Celestine Vale entered as though stepping onto an empty stage. She wore a charcoal grey gown with buttons fastened to the throat. No pipe today, no lavender haze, only her steady, unreadable expression. Poirot motioned gently to the settee across from him. Merci, madame. I hoped you would come. Celestine sat without speaking. Poirot folded his hands. You are a woman accustomed to knowing things before others do. That is a rare trait. She tilted her head faintly. And dangerous, if misunderstood. Just so, Poirot said. But it is often not what we know, but what we hide. That becomes dangerous. She smiled, just barely. You think I'm hiding something? I think, Poirot said carefully, that you have protected something, and now that thing has turned into a shadow. Celestine's fingers knotted together. She did not reply. Poirot continued softly. The letter Lady Agnes was writing at the time of her death, it was not a will, it was not financial, it was personal, emotional, a statement, one that named someone she no longer trusted. Celestine remained still. Poirot leaned slightly forward. Felix burned the unsigned will, but he never touched the letter, and yet it too vanished. Only one person could have taken it. Her voice came quiet, almost flat. You think I removed it? I think you found it, after the murder. And I think you kept it, believing it would shield the truth until you were certain whom it condemned. She looked away for a long time, then finally said, I didn't know who to trust. No, Poirot said. You suspected everyone, even yourself. He withdrew a folded sheet of paper from his inner pocket, aged, creased, the bottom edge torn and warped slightly by ink. It was not the original, but a transcription Poirot had reconstructed from faint impressions left on the blotter. She wrote, he read aloud, I never saw it until today. Not in the lies, but in the silence. The omission, the convenience. I have been a fool, and so I must say it clearly. If something happens to me, look to the one who never asked for anything, yet needed everything. He looked up. Does that sound like you, madame? Celestine's throat moved, but she did not speak. Poirot said softly, "You were Lady Agnes's closest companion, and yet, in the final days, she kept her suspicions from even you." "That must have stung." "I wasn't her daughter," Celestine whispered. "No matter how much I sacrificed, I was her reflection, useful when needed, vanished when not." Poirot waited, allowing the silence to draw breath. Celestine straightened at last. "I did find the letter. Crumpled beneath the edge of the desk, behind the cabinet. I didn't know what to make of it. It didn't name anyone. Just that line, the one who never asked but needed everything." "And who did you believe she meant?" "I wasn't sure," Celestine said. "Lydia, perhaps. She always slinked into her aunt's affections when the wind turned, but lately there was something else. Someone else." Poirot nodded slowly. "Someone whose entire presence was built on need, not desire." A pause. Then Celestine said quietly, "The maid." "Oui," Poirot said. "Maura Liddell, polite, pale, grateful to serve. But not just any maid. No. An orphan brought in from a cousin's connection. A girl who studied Lady Agnes's routine with precision, who listened, who watched." Celestine's eyes narrowed. "She was a child." "Was," Poirot agreed, "but children grow, and sometimes they grow resentful when told that loyalty does not equal inheritance." Celestine sat back, stunned. "You think—" Poirot nodded once. "I believe Maura found the letter while clearing the tray. I believe she realized Lady Agnes had discovered something. Something that threatened her presence in the household." Celestine's voice cracked. "But what would she gain?" "Not gain," Poirot said. "Protect the illusion of place. If Lady Agnes had uncovered some small theft, a missing brooch, a misplaced coin, or suspected her of manipulating others, she may have planned to dismiss her." Celestine's voice returned, faint and trembling. "She wouldn't have survived that. She needed this house." Poirot stood slowly. "She did not act out of greed, Madame. She acted out of fear. And desperation, like opium, dulls judgment but sharpens motive." Celestine stared at him, the weight of the revelation dawning in her face. Poirot turned toward the window, watching as two constables crossed the lawn. Maura Liddell's figure moved beyond them, stepping through the side door with a tray balanced in her hand. Her face was calm, unassuming, but Poirot saw it now, how carefully composed she always was. How her grief had no edges, how her loyalty had, perhaps, turned inward. He looked back to Celestine. "The letter was unsigned, but the truth, madam, it carries its own signature." And then he left the room, quietly, like a man who had read the final page before the others reached the turning. Chapter 11. A house built on quiet. Maura Liddell moved through Charnwood Grange like a thread, visible only if one looked long enough at the seams. She was neither invisible nor intrusive, simply present in every moment that did not demand attention. She poured tea without a tremor, folded linen without sound, and vanished before her presence could linger in the air. But this morning, Poirot did not allow her to vanish. He found her in the morning room, carefully arranging a fresh vase of gardenia on the sideboard. The smell was crisp, clean, a stark contrast to the undercurrent of tension that filled the house. "Ah, Maura," Poirot said with deliberate cheer. "Such a steady hand. It is a gift." Maura turned, startled. "Oh, thank you, sir. Do you mind if I sit while you work?" Her eyes flicked to the vase, then back to him. "Of course not." Poirot eased into a cushioned armchair near the hearth. He watched her for a moment, observing not just movement, but restraint. Her gestures were too careful, more curated than habitual. That, he thought, was where the truth often lay. Not in what a person did, but in how consciously they did it. "You must have known Lady Agnes's routines better than anyone," he said lightly. Mora hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, she liked precision. Same tea blend, same writing pen. She even kept the study clock 5 minutes fast so she could feel she was always ahead of time." "Ah, delightful," Poirot mused. "And was she in good health, truly?" Mora lowered her gaze. "Not particularly. Her hands trembled sometimes when she wrote. She couldn't bear noise, and she hated drafts. That's why she always locked the French doors. She told me once. A chill in the air is a hole in your armor." Poirot watched her closely. "So you cleared her tray the next morning after the discovery?" "Yes," Mora replied softly. "And what did you see when you entered?" The room was as they'd left it. Ink spilled. The teacup. Cold. A single chair pulled out, her hand still holding the pen. Poirot nodded, thoughtful. "You said once you thought you heard her speaking the night before." "From outside the door." Mora's lips pressed together. "Yes." Poirot stood. "And yet, no one else claimed to have heard anything." She looked up. "That doesn't mean I lied." "No, mademoiselle. But perhaps it means you heard more than you have said." He stepped closer, his voice quieter now. "You were fond of Lady Agnes, yes?" Mora's voice tightened. "She was everything I had." Poirot let that sit. Then, "And yet in her final days, she grew cold to you. She changed the locks on her correspondence cabinet, moved her personal ledgers to her bedroom, began drafting documents without your knowledge." Mora's face was still, but her hands betrayed her. One finger twitched against the porcelain vase just once. "You see," Poirot continued gently, "I believe Lady Agnes began to suspect you. Not of theft, not in the usual sense, but of insertion, quietly becoming indispensable, shifting appointments, delivering messages selectively. She may have feared she'd been managed." A flicker of something passed through Mora's eyes, faint, fast, gone in an instant. "She was going to dismiss you," Poirot said softly. "Not out of cruelty, but because she feared being seen as weak. She believed your need made you dangerous, and perhaps—" She was not wrong. Mora straightened. "I didn't kill her." "No," Poirot said. "But I think you interrupted something. You entered the study late that night. Perhaps to plead, perhaps to explain. But when you arrived, Felix had already come and gone. She was alone, and you saw what she was writing." Mora swallowed. "She said I wasn't owed anything, that no one had promised me a place." "And that was the moment," Poirot said, "when the illusion cracked. The idea that loyalty alone would save you." "She didn't even look at me when she said it," Mora whispered. "Just dipped the pen again and went back to writing." Poirot stepped forward. "And what happened next, Mora?" She said nothing. Poirot opened his hand. Resting in his palm was the burned scrap retrieved from the hearth, the piece of the missing will, still faintly bearing Lady Agnes's handwriting. "I think," he said, "you took the letter and fled. You left her alive. But the fear of losing your place had already ignited something in you. So when she was found dead the next morning, you told yourself you'd done nothing." "I didn't—" she started, then stopped. Poirot said, "But you never told anyone you had seen her alive." "Because if you did, you might have to explain why you were in the room." Tears welled in Mora's eyes, but did not fall. "I just wanted to matter," she whispered. Poirot bowed his head slightly. "We all do." A long silence passed. Then Mora straightened, wiping at her face with the back of one hand. "What happens now?" Poirot's voice was kind but firm. "The truth must be known, and then, perhaps, a softer justice can follow. But it begins with honesty." He turned toward the door. Behind him, Mora stood very still as the weight of a quiet life finally made itself felt. Chapter 12. Echoes in the Stairwell. By early evening, Charnwood Grange had retreated into itself. The wind had returned, not the cutting kind, but a low murmur like breath along the walls. Poirot ascended the main staircase slowly, each footstep deliberate against the faded runner. He carried with him no notebook, no files, no clues. Only a certainty that had sharpened into something heavier than theory. Outside the drawing-room, he paused. From within came the faint clatter of a teacup and the rustle of fabric. Lydia and Felix had retreated there earlier, summoned by a formal but gentle request. Celestine Vale sat near the hearth, her posture ramrod straight, her eyes on the flames, and in the corner, silent and ghost-like, stood Mora Liddell. Poirot entered, greeted by a hush. "Mes amis," he said, pausing in the doorway, "you are wondering why I ask you here once more, why I prolong this strange vigil." Felix folded his arms. "Because someone here murdered my aunt." Poirot inclined his head. "Oui, but not out of greed, as many believed, nor ambition, though that too played its part. This crime, like most, was born of a need not to gain, but to keep." He stepped forward slowly, his voice growing more measured. "You see, there was no grand inheritance scheme, no hidden fortune locked in a drawer. The money, the pendant, even the will, these were merely shadows dancing on the wall. The truth is simpler and more devastating." He turned to Lydia first. "You, mademoiselle, played your games with elegance, aligning yourself with whichever relative had the ear of your aunt. You resented Miss Vale, certainly, but not enough to kill." Lydia looked away, expression tight. She was suffocating her. "Perhaps," Poirot allowed. But Lady Agnes had been suffocated by many things far longer than that. Her illness, her legacy, her memories. Then Poirot turned to Felix. "You, monsieur, burned the will, a crime of cowardice, not of violence." Felix tensed. "I have already admitted that." "And your cowardice," Poirot said evenly, "allowed the real crime to take place. You fled when you saw your aunt could not be persuaded, and you left the door ajar." The fire crackled. Poirot now faced Celestine Vale. "And you, madame, you knew more than you claimed. You found the second copy of the will. You kept it not to protect yourself, but perhaps to protect the memory of the woman you served." Celestine met his gaze squarely. "You think I would protect her murderer?" "I think," Poirot said, "you didn't know who that was until this morning, and once you suspected, it hurt more than you cared to admit." Then he turned, slowly, to Mora. She did not meet his eyes. "Mora Liddell," he said gently, "it is time." Everyone turned toward her. Poirot stepped closer, but not too close. His voice softened. "You were not born to this house. You served it, lived quietly inside its walls. You knew Lady Agnes's rhythms, her habits, her rituals, and one day, when she looked at you not as her companion, but as an interloper, you broke." Mora whispered, "No." "You didn't plan it. You didn't poison her tea. You didn't stab her in her chair. But when you came to plead, perhaps one final time, and she looked at you like she was already erasing you, something inside you shifted." Mora shook her head, her hands trembling now. "She dismissed you with words too sharp, called your need presumption, called your presence a mistake, and you, already teetering on the edge of invisibility, reached for something. A candlestick? A letter opener?" Felix flinched. It was missing. Poirot nodded. "Yes, you picked it up, Mora. Not to kill, but to frighten. But Lady Agnes, proud to the end, did not recoil. She turned her back on you, and in that moment, your fear became action." Mora's voice broke through the room, thin and raw. "She told me to leave. After everything, I thought I was her family. She looked at me like I was just staff." Poirot's voice was quiet. "And so you struck." Silence descended. Even the fire had gone still. Mora stood frozen. Her face crumpled, but no tears came. "I didn't mean to. I just wanted her to listen. She always said I mattered, but only when no one else was looking." Lydia stared, pale. "You killed her over hurt feelings?" Poirot raised a hand. "No. She killed over identity. The slow erasure of the self is a violence few recover from. Lady Agnes may not have seen the depth of what she denied." Felix turned away, expression unreadable. Celestine rose and crossed to Mora slowly. She did not touch her, but she looked at her long and hard, like someone seeing a face that had always been just out of focus. Poirot finally spoke again. "The authorities will take it from here. But know this, the murder was not premeditated. It was an explosion within silence, a tragedy born from the quiet that was never questioned." Mora said nothing. She did not run. She only stood beneath the weight of what had been spoken, as if her figure had merged with the old furniture of the house, one more shape bound to the walls. Poirot turned and walked into the hall. Behind him, the house groaned once, as if relieved that it no longer had to keep the secret. Chapter 13. The Dust of Finality. Charnwood Grange exhaled that night. It was not a sound nor a motion, but something subtler, an easing of posture in its walls, a release in the floorboards that had been holding their breath for days, the air no longer pressed against the windows. The hush of dread had lifted, and though justice had not yet been pronounced aloud, its shape was visible in the corners of the rooms. Poirot stood once again in the study, alone. It was here that all had converged, the unsigned letter, the vanished pendant, the whispers behind doors, the weight of names and silence. And now, the truth. Outside, constables moved with solemn discipline. Mora Liddell had not resisted. She had simply handed over her apron, wrapped her arms around herself, and stepped into the waiting carriage as if surrendering to an ending she had known was always approaching. Poirot ran his hand along the edge of the desk where Lady Agnes had once ruled her domain in pen and ink. Her handwriting had been sharp and elegant, even in age. Her life had been similarly composed, a quiet discipline, a legacy defined by restraint, and yet even such a life could fracture under the pressure of unmet expectation. Poirot sat. He did not rush the moment. He observed the room, not for clues, but for the echoes of choices made. The second teacup on the tray, the faint, still visible mark of a heel near the door, the burned fragment, once an attempt to erase the future, now a witness to what the past refused to forget. The door creaked open. Celestine Vale entered without a word. Her hands were bare. Her shoes made no sound. Poirot gestured gently to the chair opposite. She accepted. "You have come to say something," he said softly. Celestine looked toward the curtained window. "No, I came to listen. I find I have much to learn after all." Poirot inclined his head. "It was not your failure. You saw Mora. You knew she was fraying." "I didn't act," Celestine said. "Not when it counted." Poirot considered this. "Sometimes, madame, intervention feels like betrayal, and sometimes silence feels like loyalty, but both are gambles. You chose caution, others chose pressure. The result was death," she finished for him. Poirot's voice was almost a murmur. "And legacy? Broken." Celestine reached into her coat. She withdrew a folded page, the second copy of the will. "I kept this," she said, placing it on the desk. "Even after you found the one in the library, I couldn't let go of it. Perhaps part of me hoped that if no one claimed it, Agnes would remain who she was, that nothing would be rewritten." Poirot touched the paper lightly. But you know now, she had already rewritten herself. Celestine nodded, her gaze distant. I never asked her to give me the estate. And yet she did, Poirot said. Not as a gift, but as an instruction, to preserve what she believed mattered. You were the last person she truly trusted. Celestine did not speak for a long moment. Then she said quietly, I think I will sell the Grange. Poirot did not react. I'll keep the grounds, perhaps, she added. A small cottage near the yew trees. But this house, it holds too many echoes. Too much that was preserved only to be hidden. A wise choice, Poirot said. The house has served its time. As she stood to leave, she turned once more. You were right, by the way. About? Celestine offered the faintest smile. The key wasn't the emerald or the will. It was the letter, that broken, unfinished thought. Poirot nodded. Yes, because an unsigned letter has no power until someone fears what it might have said. She left without further words. The door closed gently behind her. Poirot remained in the study a few minutes longer. Then, rising, he crossed to the bookshelf. Not the false one, but a genuine row of unread volumes. He selected a thin, yellowing copy of the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, opened it, and ran his fingers along the inside cover. Lady Agnes had written something there once, in faded ink. What we do in silence, we carry forever. Poirot closed the book. Later, in the entry hall, Inspector Farrow met him beside the fire. The constables had departed. Only the dying embers glowed. It's done, Farrow said. Charges won't be light, but I'll ask the Crown to consider the context. Poirot offered a mild smile. It is not mercy to see a soul clearly. It is justice. Farrow nodded once. You'll return to London? Oui, Poirot replied. There is a train at dawn. I shall miss the fog. Farrow chuckled. You're welcome to it. As the inspector turned away, Poirot took one last look up the stairs toward the gallery of ancestral portraits. Their painted eyes stared back, some noble, some tired, none innocent. He stepped outside into the brittle air. Charnwood Grange stood behind him, still as a tomb and quieter now. Its secrets had been spoken, and Hercule Poirot, ever the servant of order in a world made crooked by grief, ambition, and fear, walked calmly toward the gate, his silhouette swallowed by the morning mist. Chapter 14. The Quiet That Remains. The train pulled away from the station with a sigh of steam and the gentle clatter of wheels on frost-laced rails. Hercule Poirot sat upright in a first-class carriage, his overcoat neatly folded, his gloved hands resting upon his cane. The scenery beyond the window passed in long silver ribbons, bare trees, stone fences, the occasional startled rook taking flight into the pale sky. But his mind was not on the landscape. It was still in Derbyshire. Charnwood Grange, for all its grandeur, had begun to rot from within long before Lady Agnes's murder. The tragedy had not introduced that rot. It had simply made it visible. Stripped of appearances, the house had revealed itself as a fortress of control, and Poirot, in uncovering the truth, had dismantled it brick by brick. He reviewed the facts, as he always did after a case. Not for confirmation, but for clarity. Maura Liddell had not planned the crime. That mattered. Her intent had not been malicious, but it had spiraled from desperation into irreversible consequence. Her silence afterward, her refusal to reveal she'd spoken with Lady Agnes that night, had only deepened the wound. Poirot had seen it in her eyes. Not cunning, but terror. And Celestine Vale. She had been neither villain nor victim, but a figure too long trapped in another woman's shadow. She had accepted her place until the moment her presence became threatening. Then she, too, had gone silent. But silence, Poirot knew, was never neutral. The pendant, the will, the ledger, they had all been secondary. It was the unsigned letter, the trembling confession Agnes had begun and never completed, that had opened the way. It had offered no names, no details, only implication, and fear had done the rest. A quiet knock interrupted his thoughts. A young porter stood outside his compartment. "Telegram for you, sir. Just handed in at the last stop." Poirot took the folded message with a nod. He opened it carefully. From Inspector Farrow to Hercule Poirot, Mora Liddell, formerly charged with involuntary manslaughter. Recommended leniency granted. No contest offered. Celestine Vale will take possession of the estate. Thought you would like to know. F. Poirot folded the telegram precisely, then placed it into the inner pocket of his coat. He allowed himself no smile, only a subtle, inward softening. The world often clamored for theatrical justice. But in this case, truth had asked only for recognition, and received it. The train continued its rhythmic pace southward. As the hours passed, Poirot closed his eyes but did not sleep. He drifted instead into that curious liminal space between rest and thought, where his little grey cells could wander. He thought of Hastings, so often at his side, missing now these quiet country cases. What would his old friend have said about the affair at Charnwood? Likely something skeptical and sentimental. Surely a maid couldn't have done it, Poirot. She looked like a frightened kitten. Poirot smiled at the imagined voice. Mais oui, mon ami, but it is often the kitten who scratches when cornered. By the time he arrived in London, the sky had turned the color of tin. Damp, uncertain light filtered through the great canopy of Victoria Station. Poirot stepped onto the platform and made his way through the bustling crowd. His small suitcase wheeled carefully behind him. His driver met him with punctual formality, and soon he was gliding through familiar streets once more. Tea shops, clubs, newsboys shouting headlines that had nothing to do with Charnwood. But Charnwood followed him. That evening, in his Whitehall flat, Poirot sat alone with a fresh tisane. The fireplace crackled. The world outside his window glistened with fine rain. He opened a new notebook. Across the first page, he wrote, "The shadow who smoked her pipe." A study in silence, inheritance, and the grief of unseen people. He paused, pen poised. The title, of course, was not literal. Celestine Vale's pipe had been a symbol, one of many. It had signaled presence, control, the dignity of someone who had learned to be heard without speaking. And yet in the end, she had also become part of the silence that killed. Poirot began to write, not for the police, nor for a court, but for himself. He recorded not only the sequence of events, but the feeling of the house, the slow creak of resentment in its floorboards, the cold pride in its portraits, the strange tenderness of Agnes's unfinished sentence. He wrote of Felix, a man trained for wealth but not for relevance. Of Lydia, whose ambition wore civility like lace over steel. Of Mora, a girl who asked for nothing but took too much. Of Celestine, who had once believed she could become invisible without consequence. And of Lady Agnes herself, who had ruled over them all not with affection, but with arrangement. Each figure moved in Poirot's memory like pieces on a chessboard. But the crime had not been a checkmate. It had been a blunder, a slip of judgment that changed the whole course of the game. He made note of that too. When he finished writing, he set down the pen and looked toward the fire. A clock ticked softly behind him. Then, as he often did when a case had closed but the air still hummed with its residue, Poirot rose, went to his little table, and polished his shoes. Slowly, deliberately. Left, then right. It was not an eccentricity, as many believed, but a ritual, a return to order. And tomorrow he would take on a new case, or perhaps decline one. But tonight the house in Derbyshire would sleep, finally free of whispers, and he, Hercule Poirot, would sleep too, knowing that beneath the careful lies, the buried letters, and the ruined heirlooms, he had found the one thing he prized above all, the truth. Not loud, not proud, but intact. A truth that asked only to be seen, and, in the end, was. Chapter 15. The Final Gathering. 2 weeks later, the air above Charnwood Grange was still and clear. Snow had fallen silently the night before, and now the grounds wore a pale skin of white, like a memory laid over the landscape. The great house, stripped of its guests and gossip, stood motionless under the sky, its stone walls holding in nothing but time. Inside, the rooms were warm again. Fires had been lit not for grandeur but for comfort. The house no longer echoed with unspoken motives. It simply existed, quieter, cleaner, older. Celestine Vale stood in the drawing-room alone, her gloved hands wrapped around a cup of black tea. She had been back for 3 days. Not to reclaim, but to decide. Solicitors had sent papers. Surveyors had walked the grounds. And yet, she had made no definitive choice about the future of Charnwood Grange. There had been talk among the locals, the tradesmen, the distant cousins, about whether the house would be sold, or perhaps donated to some historical trust. But Celestine had made no announcements. She wandered the rooms like a woman exploring the pages of a book she had once written and forgotten. And now she had a visitor. The telegram had arrived that morning, not from Scotland Yard, nor the solicitors. It had been signed only with 2 initials, H.P. He arrived at precisely 3 o'clock. The Bentley glided over the crushed stone drive and came to a precise stop before the door. Poirot stepped out, clothed immaculately in a grey overcoat with a velvet collar and a silk scarf knotted just so. Celestine opened the door before the bell was rung. "I expected you," she said. Poirot bowed. "Of course you did." They moved together into the drawing-room, where she gestured to the same seat he had taken during their last gathering, the one where Mora had stood, trembling and mute as the pieces of the mystery had been laid bare. "Tea?" she asked. "Always," Poirot replied, removing his gloves. "But only a half cup. I'm still, alas, digesting the horrors of railway dining." Celestine smiled faintly and poured with steady hands. There was no opium in the blend, no lingering scent of lavender smoke. The pipe was gone from the room. "Are you here to remind me of what happened?" she asked as she handed him his tea. "No," Poirot said gently. "I'm here to witness what comes next." She sat across from him, folding one leg beneath the other, her posture almost austere. "I have not made a decision yet," she said, "about the estate." "Then allow me to share something that may help." He reached into the inner lining of his coat and withdrew a small envelope, cream-colored, sealed with a faded blue wax stamp. Celestine looked at it, cautious. "What is that?" "Something Lady Agnes left." "Not a will? Not a confession? A letter? Addressed to me?" "No," Poirot said. "Addressed to no one. It was found among her earlier correspondence, behind a false drawer in the study desk. The envelope was marked with a date, March 1922, 3 years after you entered her service." Celestine took the letter slowly, broke the seal with care. She unfolded the page. Poirot did not watch her read. He turned his attention to the fire. After a long pause, she said, "She wrote about me." "Yes. She said she admired my poise, my discretion, that she saw in me a kind of daughter she could never have borne herself." Poirot nodded. "But she never told you so." Celestine's eyes were dry, but her voice frayed slightly at the edges. "No, she didn't. She feared closeness," Poirot said, "not because she lacked affection, but because she lacked forgiveness." She could not bear the possibility of betrayal, and so she starved herself of softness. Celestine folded the letter and held it against her chest. All those years, I would have stayed even without the inheritance. And you did, Poirot said softly. You stayed even when the will had not named you, even when she was cold. I thought she was protecting herself, Celestine said. Now I wonder if she thought she was protecting me. Poirot gave a small smile. Perhaps both? A moment passed between them. The silence now was of a different breed. Mutual, respectful, heavy, but not suffocating. Then Poirot placed his tea on the table and stood. I will not stay the night. I'm expected in London for a consultation, a matter of poisoned cigars, can you imagine? Celestine gave a soft laugh. Poirot, do you ever rest? Rest, madame? He said, straightening his tie. There will be plenty of rest in the grave. Until then, I polish my shoes and hunt inconsistencies. She stood as well. Thank you. For coming. For everything. Poirot inclined his head. And thank you for preserving more than a house. He reached for his gloves, but just as he turned toward the door, she said, Would you like to see the portrait? He paused. Portrait? In the upstairs gallery, Lady Agnes had one painted of me. I never knew she finished it. Poirot's brows lifted. Ah, then I would be most honored. They ascended the staircase together, slow and measured. The house did not creak anymore. Its spine had settled. At the far end of the upper gallery, where the ancestral faces hung in succession, tall men with powdered wigs, sharp-eyed women in silks and pearls. There was one new canvas. It was smaller, quieter. Celestine Vale sat in a high-backed chair in a garden setting. No grand pose, no symbolic props, just her, seated, thoughtful, and composed. Her hands rested in her lap. In the distance, a column of hedge and iron gate blurred into shadow, but there, unmistakably, was the pipe, resting on a nearby table, unlit. Poirot studied it for a long moment. She had this commissioned in secret? Celestine nodded. The artist wrote to me 2 days ago, said Lady Agnes never came to the final sitting. She sent a letter instead, describing how I looked when I thought no one was watching. Poirot smiled gently. She saw you, after all. They stood there for a time, not speaking, just looking. Then Poirot turned to descend the stairs, and Celestine remained in the gallery, watching her portrait. Not with pride, but with a quiet kind of peace, like someone who had finally found their shape in a room full of other people's shadows. Chapter 16. The Fingerprints of Legacy. It was early April when the first appraisal team arrived at Charnwood Grange. Their steps were brisk, their instruments modern, and their questions utilitarian. Was this desk original to the house? Are these ledgers authentic? Do the attics still contain the travel trunks of Admiral Charnwood? Celestine Vale walked with them for a time, pointing out pieces with quiet authority. What had been inherited, what had been acquired, what had merely lingered. But she did not speak about sentiment. She knew now more than ever that history was not something one could inventory. It bled into wallpaper, into floorboards, into the invisible echoes that had once shaped every conversation in every room. After 20 minutes, she left the appraisers to their task and retreated to the west-facing morning room, where the light poured in through the tall windows and the house seemed for a moment not haunted, but simply old. A fire was already crackling. She had lit it herself. There, waiting as promised, was the envelope Hercule Poirot had left her, sealed, unopened. Delivered just before his departure from the train platform at Derby, with the simple words, "Not for now, for when the house no longer breathes." She had held on to it for days. Now she broke the seal with the care of someone unwrapping a mirror. Inside, a single sheet, folded twice, the handwriting neat, unmistakable, Belgian. Madame Vale, a house is not just a place, it is an agreement between walls and memory, between inheritance and intention. You have inherited a structure, but more than that, a silence. And I suspect you are not eager to live inside either. My recommendation is neither to sell nor to abandon. Instead, consider this. Reshape, not into a museum which embalms, not into a hotel which forgets, but into something living, a home for those who, like Mora, were nearly forgotten before their shadows turned into cries. You need not be their caretaker, but you might be their witness. With respect and sincerity, Hercule Poirot. Celestine sat for a long time after reading it. The fire snapped quietly beside her. Outside, the wind moved the daffodils in the garden below. For a long while, she had believed her place at Charnwood was conditional, that she had survived by being still, by taking up as little space as possible. Lady Agnes had prized control. Celestine had learned to mimic it. But now, Poirot's letter had proposed something different. That presence itself could be an act of reclamation. That inheritance need not repeat what it had been. She stood slowly and walked through the halls. Upstairs, the portrait of herself still hung in the gallery, surrounded by the glowering patriarchs and severe matrons of Charnwood's past. She paused before it. The face in the painting was thoughtful, almost kind, and unmistakably separate from those around it. Even the frame was simpler. She continued walking. Down the corridor, past the old nursery, past the linen cupboards, to the locked door at the end of the servants' wing. It opened with a brass key she hadn't touched in years. The room beyond was narrow, windowless, with a slanted ceiling. Dust lay like wool across the floorboards. In the corner, a trunk marked L. Charnwood, Lady Agnes's younger sister, long since deceased, and beside it, a shallow cabinet of old ledgers and letters, all left behind without ceremony. Celestine ran a finger along the edge of the cabinet. Then she opened the top drawer. It creaked as if surprised to be touched again. Inside were dozens of folded letters. Some opened, some never sent. Fragments of lives paused and never resumed. She took a handful and carried them back to the fire. She read in silence. One was a request for funds from a niece living abroad. Another, an apology from a former cook who had left in disgrace. A third, a thank you from Mora, dated the week she had arrived. I don't know if I will be useful, Mora had written in an uncertain script, but I will try. I'm tired of not being seen. Celestine closed the letter and placed it gently into her lap. Then she stood. She returned to the entry hall and took down the heavy brass placard that still hung beside the door. Charnwood Grange, established 1814. She set it on the hall table. Then she reached for a pen and an old blotter, and she began to write. To whom it may concern, Charnwood Grange will be reopening in late summer, not as a family estate, nor as a landmark, but as a quiet home for women who need a place to stand still and start again. Those with nowhere else to be remembered, those whose hands know work, whose silence has endured, whose stories were interrupted. There will be no pamphlets, no press, only warmth and firelight. If you are reading this, perhaps you are meant to come. She signed only her name. No title, no claim. Then she placed the letter inside the blank leather ledger she found in the morning-room desk drawer, the one Lady Agnes had bought but never used. A clean beginning. She sat beside the fire until the sun had fallen and the corners of the house once again filled with shadow. But this time, the shadows felt gentler, like they had been asked to stay, not because they were forgotten, but because they were finally understood. When she rose, the room seemed taller, the silence no longer judged. And as she passed the portrait gallery once more, Celestine paused beneath her own image and whispered something aloud. Only 5 words. words Maura had never heard, though she had longed for them. "You are seen. Come in." Chapter 17. The Names That Weren't Written. The wind shifted gently across the moors in early May, brushing the edges of the countryside in softer tones. Grass grew again along the flagstone paths of Charnwood Grange. A few hardy crocuses had emerged near the gateposts, defiant and bright. Inside, the house no longer stood still. Painters arrived first, followed by glaziers, then an elderly carpenter who moved slowly but with the quiet grace of someone who'd once apprenticed under Agnes's father. The shutters were repaired. The roof was cleared. The rooms were neither gutted nor restored. They were released. The heavy velvet drapes were replaced with linen. The family portraits were rehung, but interspersed now with unframed sketches, charcoal figures seated in moments of ordinary grace, reading, sweeping, listening. The silence was still there. But it was no longer unspoken. It was chosen. On the last Friday of May, a small van arrived bearing 4 women and their bags. No press releases announced the day. There were no ceremonies, no cameras. Only tea in the drawing room and bread still warm from the kitchen. The first to arrive was Mrs. Ada Hemley, a retired librarian with nowhere to return after her flat had been condemned. Then came Esme Finch, who had walked away from a life of caretaking and been surprised to find herself alone at 38. Next, a young woman named Nora, with ink-stained fingers and a distant look. And finally, a girl who said her name was Olive, and that she had come because she read the letter and knew what it meant. Celestine greeted each with the same words. "This house is old, but not haunted. You may rest here, or begin again, that's all." Some cried, some didn't, but none of them asked for permission to stay. They simply stayed. That evening, after the dishes were done and the kitchen had gone quiet, Celestine walked to the study. She lit a single lamp and opened the drawer where the old stationery had once lived. The parchment was gone, but she had restocked it with something simpler: lined notebooks, ink pens, a box of charcoal pencils. She opened one of the notebooks now, and she began a list. Names never recorded in the ledgers: Mrs. Wright, the cook who left in winter, unsent for June Mallory; gardener's daughter, dismissed for laughing too loudly, Mavis Tilling; seamstress, disappeared in 1904; Helen Vale, my mother Maura Liddell. Faithful until the moment she wasn't, which was still faithful in its way. Celestine paused. Her hand trembled just slightly. Then she continued. Lady Agnes Charnwood, builder of doors she never opened. Holder of too much weight. She tried. That matters. She closed the book and tucked it beneath the floorboard, loose beneath the rug. Not hidden, just placed. A record for those who would one day live in the space and wonder whose lives had passed quietly through these halls. She looked around the room once more and noticed the change. The study no longer bristled. Its edges had softened. It had not become something new. It had become what it had never been allowed to be: private, gentle, unfinished. That night, the house breathed like a thing newly waking. In London, Hercule Poirot also sat at a desk. His apartment on the 3rd floor of a modest but elegant building near Whitehall was quiet, save for the faint ticking of a clock and the rustle of the newspaper folded at his elbow. He had not spoken of Charnwood since returning, but he had thought of it often, not of the crime, nor even of the solution, but of the aftermath. Of how, when a murder is solved, there remains still the matter of what the place will remember. Most crimes do not vanish with conviction. They live on, etched into rooms, habits, and absences. He had wondered what Celestine would do with that truth. Now, a small envelope rested on his desk. He opened it slowly. Inside was a photograph. 4 women, standing beside the balustrade of Charnwood's upper gallery. Sunlight streamed through the windows. One of the women, older, held a teacup. Another leaned with a pencil tucked behind her ear. They were not smiling for the camera. They were simply present. Poirot turned the photograph over. Written in simple black ink. The house is quieter, but it does not feel alone. CV. He looked at the photograph once more and smiled. Weeks passed. The world outside turned greener. Guests came and went. Some stayed for days, others for seasons. None were turned away, provided they understood the rules. 1. You are not here to be watched. 2. You may speak your name, or not. 3. What you choose to do with your silence is your own. There were small ceremonies. A birthday. The planting of the first herb garden behind the east wing. A night where someone played the piano in the dark and others listened from the stairs. And always, in the evening, the light remained on in the morning room until the last person had gone to bed. Not because anyone needed it, but because Lady Agnes had once locked that room at dusk. And now it remained open. One evening in July, Celestine received a parcel from Geneva. The return address bore Poirot's meticulous script. Inside, beneath layers of tissue paper, was a gift, a book of Roman philosophy, rebound in deep green cloth with a ribbon in navy silk. On the inside cover, a new quote: "The soul becomes dyed with the color of its thoughts." Marcus Aurelius. And below it, in smaller script, Poirot had written, "A house too, madame." Celestine closed the book, tucked it beneath her arm. Then she crossed the drawing room, opened the wide French doors to the garden, and stepped out beneath a pale crescent moon. The air smelled of rosemary and thyme. Somewhere in the distance, someone was laughing. She did not follow the sound. She simply stood beneath the open sky, the grass cool beneath her feet. And for the first time in years, she was not a witness to someone else's legacy. She was inhabiting her own. Chapter 18. The closing remark. It was late September when the wind returned. Colder now, but not cruel. Leaves spun in quiet circles outside Charnwood Grange, brushing across the gravelled paths with the whisper of something ancient, something released. Inside, the house had learned how to hold people again. There was no schedule, no ceremony, no name for what Charnwood had become. It was not a refuge, not an institution, not a project. It was simply a place with unlocked doors and enough warmth to make it through a difficult night. A house that once knew only control had become, by quiet miracle, a place where people came to be unwritten and rewritten at once. Celestine Vale sat at her desk in the morning room, her thin shawl across her shoulders, and the first fire of the season humming gently in the hearth. A letter lay open before her, dated, precise, and typewritten with charming unevenness. It was from Hercule Poirot. "My dear Madame Vale, your last note reached me by way of a certain inspector who now drinks his tea with honey, thanks to your corrupting influence. I write to you not as detective nor guest, but as a fellow keeper of patterns. I have always admired those who know when to speak and when to let silence say more. You, Madame, have chosen well. There is no solving silence. It must be held, understood, perhaps even mourned, but never filled merely for the sake of comfort. Lady Agnes, for all her frost, created something strong enough to be remade. You have proven it. May the house now do what she could not. Soften. Yours, with admiration, Hercule Poirot." Celestine folded the letter with care and slid it between the pages of her notebook. She had filled 3 of them now. Not with accounts or plans, but with names, overheard conversations, bits of poetry, memories recovered from half-forgotten corners. She recorded not facts, but presence, as if to say, someone was here. That night, as the house settled into its autumn rhythm, a visitor arrived just past dusk. A woman in her 40s, hair clipped short, coat threadbare at the sleeves. She held no luggage, only a letter. Celestine greeted her at the door. "I read what you wrote," the woman said, voice uncertain. Celestine nodded. "Then come in." They did not ask names. Not at first. That was the agreement. The woman was shown to a room once used by a Charnwood cousin who had disappeared into the colonies and never returned. The bed was small. The view overlooked the orchard. There was a notebook and a pencil on the side table. She stayed. Others came too, one by one. Never many. Never announced. As if the house itself whispered to those who needed it. And always, Celestine welcomed them the same way. No signatures. No contracts. Just this. You are here now. That's enough. And though Lady Agnes's portrait still hung in the upper gallery, and her emerald pendant had been placed in a glass case not far from the hearth, it was the unsigned letter that had come to define the house. Not displayed, not framed, but quoted in small ways, stitched into the lining of the new curtains, carved discreetly into a stair riser, etched faintly into the teacups ordered from the village potter. If something happens to me, look to the one who never asked for anything, yet needed everything. Mora's name was never erased. It was spoken with the rest, gently, as part of the truth. One October morning, Celestine received another envelope from London, this one bearing only a calling card, HP retired, not idle. Inside, a final note. "We are all haunted, madame. The difference lies in whether we pretend otherwise. Charnwood no longer pretends. It remembers. And that, I believe, is a kind of peace." Bravo. Celestine did not write back. She didn't need to. Outside, in the turning leaves and the low fog that now wrapped gently around the walls of the old estate, the silence was no longer suspicious. It was alive, holding more than it once could, carrying the weight of what had happened and making room for what still might. And deep in the walls of Charnwood Grange, behind ledgers and letters and footfalls that no longer echoed with fear, the truth remained. It had not screamed. It had never confessed, but it had been witnessed. And Hercule Poirot, having once stepped into its shadows, had left the door ajar for light.